a UK demolition man has been shot to death. Volvo goes straight in support of the global demolition industry. And we bid a sad farewell to one of the demolition industry's true good guys. All that and more on the Weekend Wrap. And we start with a news item that really shouldn't be considered a news item at all, but it has apparently caused such a ruckus that it's now impossible to ignore. So on Friday last week, an item aired on the BBC Breakfast Show. A rejigged version then appeared in audio form on BBC Radio 2 later in the day. It was an item that was at best baseless and at worst a desperate cry for relevance from a once great institution. Before I start, we need to go back a little bit further. Regular viewers will know that I've been in talks with the BBC for several weeks now. I've been speaking to them on two fronts, actually, and one of them is still in the works, so on that one I'm sworn to secrecy. But the other, it transpires, was the item that was broadcast on Friday. I was originally approached by the BBC, or by a BBC researcher actually, who wanted to license some demolition news video footage for an item they were working on. Ever curious, I asked them what they needed it for and was told they were working on an item that weighed the environmental benefits of refurbishment over demolition. So I carefully explained how UK demolition companies regularly achieve recycling rates of 95% or more, how the construction sector is ridiculously wasteful by comparison, how the UK demolition industry doesn't just clear a path for new development, but is a key source of secondary materials for that development. I pointed out at some length how explosive demolition accounted for just a tiny proportion of all the demolition carried out on these UK shores. And I also suggested they speak to former IDE President Dr. Terry Quarmby, a vocal advocate for an end-of-life directive for buildings, and a man who has been shouting into the void for years about the need for eventual demolition to be considered even before a new building is committed to blueprint. So fast forward to Friday morning, and much of what I had told them had been forgotten, overlooked, or far more likely, did not match their environmental agenda. Instead, the BBC handed centre stage to the Royal Institute of British Architects, or RIBA, which, in a desperate bid to remain relevant in the modern age, suggested that all demolition should be banned. It should be banned because it didn't take into account the encapsulated carbon within the materials used to build the nation's existing structures, and that despite achieving recycling levels that put all other industries to shame, demolition should now be considered environmentally unfriendly. This item was thankfully balanced slightly by Dr. Terry Quarmby, who politely pointed out the flaws in that argument. He also pointed out that it was, in fact, the architects, RIBA's own members, that were designing buildings and specifying materials that are difficult, expensive, and even impossible to recycle. Despite Quarmby's protestations, the average BBC viewer probably left the breakfast show convinced that demolition firms were marauding across the landscape, imploding buildings willy-nilly and causing irreparable damage to Mother Earth in the process. So before I go on, and I do intend to go on, let's take a look at this so-called news item.
So at the moment, we're demolishing about 50,000 buildings in the UK every year, and it's a huge, huge waste. Not only are we losing our historic fabric, but there's a huge carbon impact in terms of embodied carbon. So that's the carbon emitted in creating new buildings, in creating building materials and assembling them, and sort of creating that new built fabric. We really need to be much more considerate about when we're deciding to demolish a building and when we're retrofitting it, when we're refurbishing it, and when we are disassembling buildings, that we should be recovering and salvaging all those materials and reusing them.
If they involve the demolition industry at an earlier stage of a new development, it could benefit from the input that we've had over X number of years to determine whether we can do anything or not with that building, and equally what cost there is.
The best thing you can do with buildings like these is blow them up and spend a fortune starting again from scratch.
I think it's general practice now in the industry that we are trying to reuse or recycle rather than just take to landfill. It's easy to say let's knock it down and rebuild it, but these people they work hard to try to revive the buildings. Obviously it's coming to light now that the environment has been affected and we need to do something about it. I think the industry, the building industry, is just one part of that circle which will help us understand the impact, and we've got opportunities to change the impact now.
That item was broadcast just before 7 a.m. on Friday morning. It would be another 5 or so hours before the item would reappear in a slightly different form on BBC Radio 2's Jeremy Vine show. Plenty of time, you might think, to rally a response. The self-titled Voice of the Demolition Industry responded in trademark fashion. So it fell to the incumbent IDE president, Richard Dolman, to stand up for the demolition sector on the radio and to greet this so-called news item with the disdain it so richly deserved. And just to prove how ludicrous this whole thing was, the Reba man on the radio then proposed what he believed to be a bold new idea that he called deconstruction. Now, if that term sounds familiar to you, it's because it's been a fundamental principle of the demolition industry for decades. Had this buffoon actually stepped outside of his ivory tower and visited a demolition site, he would know that he was talking, what's the expression? Yeah, bollocks. Instead, like so many institutions that are struggling for relevance in this modern age, he reached for the nearest low-hanging fruit. He could have played the gender card, or the race card, or the LGBTQ card, or even the mental health card. Hell, he could have even pointed out that an architect designed the new Wembley Stadium that was about to host the most important England football match in 55 years. Instead, he chose to play the environmental card. And the BBC, which is equally complicit in this bandwagon journalism, was only too willing to give him airtime. As I said at the outset, I feel bad that this storm in a teacup is even considered news, because it most certainly isn't. The Royal Institute of British Architects, or RIBA, is a once great institution that should be ashamed at having stooped so low in the pursuit of exposure and publicity. The BBC, another once great institution, should be ashamed at having acted as a conduit for this thinly veiled tosh. And the voice of the demolition industry, also once a great institution, chose only to react after the industry it purports to represent had been lambasted on national TV and radio. Back in 2019, around October time, if memory serves me correctly, our sister publication, Diggers and Dozers, was among a hand-picked group of titles invited to Germany to see the prototype of a new machine, the TA230 articulated dump truck from Liebherr. As you would expect, the new machine was impressive and it bore all the quality trademarks we've come to expect from Liebherr. We were all eager to see one of these machines in action and away from the unquestionably impressive test track on which Liebherr puts these trucks through their paces. And then COVID hit. And like so much of the world, further development and sales of the new TA230 went into an enforced stasis. However, the first of these machines has now arrived here in the UK, and I'm delighted to say we were among the first to see it. And now you're about to be among the first to see it too. Here we go.
This is the Liebherr TA230 articulated dump truck.
So yesterday morning, I had the pleasure of interviewing one of the product specialists at Volvo Construction Equipment about the company's new range of straight boom demolition excavators. We are working in the background on that full-length video interview, and we'll bring that to you very soon. But just to whet your appetite a little, here is an exclusive look at the machines in question. Volvo really is one of the industry's true innovators, and has clearly, I think, with these new machines, demonstrated its commitment to the demolition sector, which is fantastic to see. So keep watching. We're planning to bring you the full-length video interview in the next day or two. It is with enormous professional and personal sadness that I must announce the passing of Ron Callan of Kukuric Excavators. Ron was an absolute stalwart of the demolition industry, proof that in the rough, tough, hard-nosed business there is still room for a genuinely nice guy. I did the press relations for Kukuric Excavators for a while, and Ron was my primary contact. I'd meet with him every 4 to 6 weeks at the company's facility in Ipswich. Ron would always schedule the meetings, and they were always timed for mid to late morning, because at around noon he would start to wind things up before we both headed to the pub. Diet Coke for me and a pint, and on occasions two for Ron. I've got other photos of Ron sat on my system here, but that's how I'd like to remember him. Beer in hand and a big smile on his face. Ron retired at the end of last year due to worsening health. A lot of people knew that he was very seriously ill. He'd already worked way beyond retirement age. And I got the impression that he had no real desire to leave an industry to which he'd already given so much, and within which he had so many friends. The industry is going to be a lot less jolly for his passing. So I am dedicating this episode of the Breakfast Show to Mr. Ron Callan, an absolute one-off. It was a privilege to have known him. Death is no stranger to us here at the Breakfast Show. We've reported on more than our fair share of site fatalities, and just yesterday we lamented the passing of Kukuric Excavators' Ron Callan. But the news of the death of another UK demolition man is far more shocking. So I received a call the other night asking if I'd heard the news about Robert Williamson. For those that don't know, Robert Williamson had worked at both E. Rankin Limited and Matthew Group down in Sussex. To say that he left both under a cloud is something of an understatement, but I simply assumed that he had joined another demolition company in some capacity, and that was the news. Nothing could have prepared me for the real news. According to a local newspaper report, Williamson sustained a fatal gunshot wound at a property in Dartford just after midday, way back on the 11th of May. So we are coming to this somewhat belatedly. 69-year-old David Hucker has since pleaded not guilty to the murder after appearing at Maidstone Crown Court. Apparently, the two men were known to each other. David Hucker appeared in court via prison video link and was remanded in custody ahead of a pre-trial review hearing on the 12th of November. His trial is due to start on the 6th of December and is expected to last for 2 weeks. We will bring you more news on that just as soon as we receive it here.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider supporting us. Go to buymeacoffee.com/demolition news.